Mateo Cruz was a figure sculpted by faith, a pastor whose voice echoed through the arid hills of Michoacán like a balm for weary souls. For over 20 years, he guided his small congregation with sermons that spoke of forgiveness and hope, even as the shadow of cartel violence lengthened over their lives. A widower for a decade, his existence was distilled into two devotions, to God and to his teenage daughter Sophia, the light that illuminated his darkest days. He raised her on the same principles he preached, teaching her to see the goodness in a world that seemed increasingly lost in darkness. Mateo was a pillar in his community, a man whose compassion was as well known as the strength of his convictions, a beacon of peace in a land on the brink of war, a refugee for the afflicted, and a symbol of moral resilience. Mateo's life was a testament to his preaching. He didn't just speak of loving one's neighbor, he practiced it with tireless dedication. His days began before sunrise with fervent prayers and ended late at night, visiting the sick, counseling the desperate, or simply sharing a meal with those who had nothing. His home, attached to the modest, white-walled church, always had its doors open. It was there that he and Sophia shared their most precious moments, between Bible readings and conversations that revealed the deep bond between father and daughter. Sophia, with her bright eyes and infectious smile, was the living reflection of her father's faith, a young woman full of dreams who believed, like him, in the transformative power of forgiveness and compassion. They were a small universe of peace amidst the impending chaos. Mateo's church was more than a place of worship. It was the beating heart of the community, a sanctuary where the worries of the outside world seemed to dissipate under the simple wooden roof and the soft light that filtered through the colored stained glass windows. On Sundays, the place was packed, with people coming from neighboring villages to hear his words. He spoke with a captivating passion, his hands gesturing to emphasize each lesson on grace and redemption. For many, he was the only barrier between hope and the despair imposed by the cartel's growing violence. He knew every member of his congregation by name, shared in their joys, and more often their sorrows, offering spiritual comfort in a place where earthly justice was an empty, distant promise. His relationship with Sophia transcended that of father and daughter. It was a partnership of souls. He saw in her the kindness of his late wife and the promise of a better future. The evenings were filled with the sound of her laughter as they ate dinner, or with the shared silence of those who understand each other without words. He taught her to play the guitar, and often her gentle melodies accompanied the hymns in the church. Sophia was his anchor, the living proof that divine grace manifested in the simplest things. He worried about the world she was growing up in, a world stained by greed and cruelty, but his faith kept him steady. He believed that as long as they were together, protected by their faith, no evil could truly touch them. It was a conviction that defined him. The landscape of Michoacán, with its rustic beauty and desolate scenery, served as a constant backdrop to the duality of Mateo's life. The same mountains that offered breathtaking views at dawn hid the poppy fields and trafficking routes that fueled the invisible war. Mateo knew this reality. He heard the fearful whispers of his flock, the stories of disappearances and extortion, yet he refused to give in to fear. In his sermons, he called for courage and unity, believing that the strength of the community, founded on faith, could resist the tide of darkness. He was a stubborn optimist, a man who chose to see the light even as the shadows grew denser and more threatening around him. His preaching about turning the other cheek was not just a biblical quote, it was a lived principle. Mateo had mediated local conflicts, faced aggressors with calm words, and offered forgiveness to men whom many would consider unforgivable. His moral authority was his only weapon, and he wielded it with a wisdom that disarmed even the most hardened hearts. He believed that violence was a vicious cycle, a disease of the soul that could only be cured with compassion and understanding. This philosophy was the bedrock of his identity, the rock upon which he had built his life and his mission. He was a peacemaker in a land that had forgotten the meaning of peace, a shepherd trying to guide his flock through a valley of shadows. Despite the growing presence of the Los Espectros cartel in the region, Mateo strove to maintain a sense of normalcy, especially for Sofia. He encouraged her to focus on her studies, to dream of university in the big city, and to believe in a future far from the endemic violence. He wanted her to fly away, to a place where her kindness wouldn't be a vulnerability. Deep down, however, a silent fear began to take root in his heart. He saw the boldness of the halcones, the cartel's young lookouts, and felt the atmosphere of impunity solidifying. With every distant siren, every whispered horror story, the crack in his armor of faith deepened, almost imperceptibly. The tranquility of his life was, in truth, a thin layer of ice over an ocean of darkness about to break. The community saw him as unshakable, but in his nightly prayers, Mateo confessed his anxieties to God. He prayed for his daughter's protection, for wisdom to guide his people, and for strength not to succumb to the despair he saw in so many eyes. The image of Sofia, with her innocence and her bright future, was what drove him. She was his purpose, his greatest blessing, and, unbeknownst to him, the balancing point of his universe. A balance that was about to be shattered in a brutal and irrevocable way, dragging him into an abyss from which he would never return the same. The break happened on a Tuesday afternoon, under an indifferent blue sky. Sofia did not come home from school. Mateo's initial panic, a cold wave that shot up his spine, gave way to a frantic search. He walked the path she took every day, calling her name, his heart hammering against his ribs with every unfamiliar face, every closed door. The hours dragged on, turning the daylight into a purple, ominous twilight. The community joined him, lanterns cutting through. The growing darkness, but the night brought only a heavy silence and the echo of his own fear. Sofia's absence was a black hole that swallowed all hope, a vacuum that began to suck the very essence of the faith he had preached his entire life. The tranquility of his existence had been shattered, and the deafening sound of that shattering was all he could hear. The next morning, reality presented itself in the form of an anonymous call and a ransom demand. The voice on the other end was cold, devoid of any emotion, detailing an impossible sum and a brutal threat. It was Los Espectros. The name hung in the air like poison. Desperate, Mateo rushed to the police station in the neighboring town, his heart crushed by anguish, but still clinging to a thread of hope in the justice of men. He was met with apathy and fear. The captain, with eyes that darted away from his, spoke of a lack of resources, of the cartel's danger, and essentially told him his daughter was on her own. "Pray." "Pastor," was the officer's final advice, a phrase that sounded like the cruelest of blasphemies. It was there, in that musty room that smelled of defeat, that Mateo felt the first pillar of his world completely crumble. Abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect him, Mateo attempted the impossible. He sold what little he had, begged for donations from his impoverished congregation, humiliating himself in an attempt to gather the ransom money. Every coin represented a piece of his dignity, every bill a silent plea. But it was useless. Los Espectros were not negotiators, they were reapers. 3 days later, Sofia's body was found in a dry cornfield, a place that had once been a playground for children. The brutality of the act was indescribable, a message of power and sadism meant to terrorize anyone who dared to defy them. Upon seeing what was left of his daughter, Mateo's universe ceased to exist. The blue sky, the hills, the sound of the church bells, everything turned. Grey, muted, meaningless. The pain was a physical force, a pressure in his chest that kept him from breathing, from thinking, from feeling anything beyond an absolute void. Sofia's funeral was a blur of tearful faces and funereal hymns that seemed to mock his pain. As he stood beside the small open grave, the words of comfort from his flock were just distant noises. He looked up at the sky, not for divine solace, but with a silent accusation. The God of forgiveness and mercy was absent. In this desecrated land, only the law of the strongest prevailed. That night in his empty house, the silence was a torment. He opened his Bible, but the passages about love and patience seemed written in a foreign language. His eyes were drawn to the Old Testament stories of vengeance, of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There, in the darkness of his soul, a decision germinated. If the justice of men was corrupt and the justice of God was silent, then he himself would be the instrument of judgment. This was his final prayer, a dark pact sealed on the altar of his shattered faith. On his knees, not to ask for forgiveness, but to beg for strength, Mateo Cruz, the pastor, died. In his place, something new arose, something forged from the purest grief and hatred. He would no longer seek justice, for justice had failed. He would deliver retribution. He would become the fear that evil men felt in the dark. He would hunt down every person responsible, from the lowest sicario to the leader hiding in the shadows. From that moment on, his Bible would be his guide, not to salvation, but to condemnation. Every verse about wrath and punishment would be his justification. The transformation was complete. The pastor would become the vigilante, and his new parish would be the hell he would create on earth for his daughter's murderers. Mateo's hunt began in a raw and desperate way, driven by a blind fury. His first target was a low-level cartel informant, a young man known as El Chacal, whose name he had wrenched from a debt-ridden addict through threats that sounded strange from his own mouth. He cornered him in a filthy alley, his heart pounding erratically, his hands trembling as he held an old revolver he'd bought on the black market. The confrontation was clumsy, pathetic. El Chacal laughed at him, at the little priest playing at being a man. But when the young man mentioned Sophia's name with a sneer, something inside Mateo broke. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cutting ice. The first shot was deafening, and the brutality of the act left him breathless, covered in his first victim's blood and the weight of an irrevocably stained soul. Over the body, still shaking, he left a piece of paper torn from a pocket Bible. On it was written Ezekiel 25:17, "And I will execute great vengeance upon them with furious rebukes, and they shall know that I am the Lord, when I shall lay my vengeance upon them." This act, born from a feverish impulse, became his macabre signature. The news spread like wildfire. A killer who quoted scripture was on the loose. The press, initially treating it as just another score settling, soon noticed the pattern. Elena Morales, an investigative journalist from a capital city newspaper, was the first to connect the dots. Intrigued by the bizarre combination of theology and violence, she traveled to Michoacán, sniffing out the story that could define her career, never imagining she was about to plunge into the abyss of a broken man's soul. Mateo learned quickly. Pain and hatred were merciless teachers. He realized that brute force was not enough. He had to be smarter, faster, more ruthless than his enemies. He began to watch, to study the routines of the cartel members. He learned to move in the shadows, to use the terrain to his advantage, turning the rural landscape that was once his home into his personal hunting ground. His appearance changed. The man of simple clothes and serene countenance gave way to an emaciated figure with sunken eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. He abandoned his home, his church, and began to live like a ghost, sleeping in abandoned barns and eating what he could find, fueled only by his thirst for vengeance and the memories of his daughter. The second target was a cartel enforcer, a brutal man responsible for dozens of deaths. Mateo followed him for days, learning his habits, his arrogance, his lowered guard. The execution was methodical, cold. He set an ambush on a deserted dirt road, using the darkness of night as his ally. This time there was no hesitation. Violence had become second nature, a language he now spoke fluently. With every man he killed, he moved further away from the pastor he had been. The memories of his sermons on forgiveness haunted him during the long, lonely nights, ghostly voices from a past that seemed to belong to another life. He was at war not only with the cartel, but with the wreckage of his own conscience. Meanwhile, Captain Ramirez, the same police officer who had dismissed Mateo, was put in charge of the hunt for the vigilante pastor. Pressured by his superiors, who in turn were pressured by the cartel, Ramirez found himself in an impossible position. Secretly, he understood Mateo's fury. He himself was an honest man, frustrated by the corruption that paralyzed his department and allowed monsters like Los Espectros to act with impunity. Hunting Mateo was hunting the direct consequence of his own failure, of his own impotence. This duality consumed him, turning the investigation into a complex moral chess game where he wasn't sure if he actually wanted to capture the man he was hunting or if, deep down, he was rooting for him. The legend of Mateo Cruz grew with each new body found with a Bible verse. For the terrified populace, he became an ambiguous figure. Some saw him as a monster, a killer as cruel as those he hunted. Others, however, saw him as an avenging angel, the only one to bring any kind of justice to a land forsaken by God and the state. In cantinas and markets, his name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. He had become a myth, a phantom who punished the wicked. This notoriety was a double-edged sword. It inspired fear in his enemies, but it also intensified the manhunt by the authorities and the cartel itself, which now offered a substantial reward for his head. Elena Morales, in her investigation, began to unearth the rot infesting the region. She discovered the extent of Los Espectros infiltration into the police, politics, and the local economy. The deeper she dug, the more sympathy she felt for Mateo's cause. She published a series of articles that exposed the corruption and painted a complex portrait of the vigilante pastor, not as a psychopath, but as a symptom of a collapsing system. Her reporting put her in the cartel's crosshairs, but it also brought her closer to the truth about Mateo. She sought a meeting, an interview, that could reveal the man behind the legend, not realizing that in doing so, she was becoming a piece on the board of his deadly game. One of the most difficult moments for Mateo was his chance encounter with Isabella, an elderly woman who had been one of the most devout members of his church. She found him by accident in a small village where he had stopped for food, her eyes filled with tears upon seeing his transformation. She didn't accuse him, didn't judge him. She simply held his hand and said she still prayed for him, for the pastor she knew. That simple gesture of compassion was like a knife to his heart. Isabella represented everything he had lost: his faith, his humanity, his ability to accept comfort. He pushed her away harshly, not out of anger, but because her kindness was a mirror reflecting the monster he had become, and that was an image he could not bear to face. The hunt led him to one of El Silencioso's lieutenants, a man known as El Carnicero, the butcher. The confrontation was brutal, a bloody fight in an abandoned slaughterhouse. Mateo was wounded, a deep gash in his side, but his determination was unshakable. In the end, exhausted and blood-soaked, he prevailed. Before delivering the final blow, he interrogated the man, seeking information on the whereabouts of the cartel leader. The information came, but at a cost. The fight had pushed him to his physical and mental limits. As he walked away, leaving behind another body and another verse, he felt a profound weariness, not of the body but of the soul. Vengeance was a poison that kept him alive, but it was corroding him from within. Wounded, Mateo sought refuge in a ruined church in the mountains, a place that hadn't been visited in years. There, among the broken stone saints and dusty pews, he tended to his wound. The irony of the location was not lost on him. He was bleeding in a house of God, a God he no longer believed in. In that silence, the memories of Sophia assaulted him with overwhelming force. He remembered her laughter, her questions about heaven, her innocent faith. The pain of his loss, which he masked with the fury of his revenge, resurfaced, raw and devastating. He wept for the first time since the funeral, a silent, bitter cry from a man who had lost everything, including himself. Captain Ramirez, following the trail of violence, was closing in. He found the slaughterhouse, and from the brutality of the scene, he knew that Mateo was becoming more desperate, more dangerous. Ramirez wasn't just following orders, he was trying to anticipate the pastor's next moves, hoping he could reach him before the spiral of violence consumed him completely. He spoke with Isabella, who, despite her fear, confirmed she had seen Mateo, describing the pain in his eyes. It became clear to Ramirez that Mateo was not a monster but a man in agony. This made his mission even more conflicted. He had to stop the killing, but arresting Mateo felt like a betrayal of a distorted form of justice that he himself, in his darkest moments, desired. Elena Morales, using her sources, obtained a crucial piece of information, the name of a local politician who served as a front for El Silencioso's money laundering operations. She knew that publishing this information would make her a direct target, but it was also the only way to shake the cartel's power structure. She made a risky decision. Instead of publishing, she would use the information as bait to try to contact Mateo, believing he was the only one who could act. She left a coded message in a newspaper ad, a dangerous gamble that could lead to her death or the biggest story of her life. It was a point of no return, a dive into the darkness alongside the very ghost she was investigating. Mateo, recovering in his abandoned church, saw Elena's message. He understood the code, a reference to a hymn he used to sing. His initial distrust gave way to curiosity. He knew she was a journalist, but her articles showed an understanding of his cause that no one else seemed to have. He needed information, and she appeared to have it. He agreed to a meeting, choosing a neutral location, an old cemetery at dusk. The decision to trust someone, even minimally, was the first deviation from his solitary path. It was a calculated risk, but he knew that to get to El Silencioso, he could no longer act completely alone. The war required allies, even the most unlikely ones. The meeting was tense. The silhouettes of Mateo and Elena were stark against the orange sky among the time-worn tombstones. She handed him a dossier with everything she had discovered, detailing the network of corruption that protected El Silencioso. Their eyes met, and she saw in him not a monster but an abyss of pain. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Because no one else will bring justice for your daughter. Because my brother was also taken by them," she replied, revealing her personal motivation for the first time. In that moment, a fragile alliance was forged, based not on trust, but on shared grief and a common enemy. With Elena's information, Mateo planned his next attack, his most audacious yet. He targeted the cartel's financial arm, an accountant operating under the cover of an export company. The goal was not just to kill, but to burn the money, to cut off El Silencioso's source of power. The operation was meticulous, demonstrating his evolution from a passionate avenger to a lethal strategist. He infiltrated the building at night, a silent spectre moving through the corridors. The attack was swift and precise, ending with a fire that consumed millions of the cartel's dollars and left another body with a Bible verse, this time from Proverbs: "Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished." The financial blow infuriated El Silencioso. For the first time, the cartel leader, who had always operated from the shadows, felt the threat personally. He doubled the reward on Mateo's head and ordered a merciless manhunt, mobilizing dozens of his best sicarios. The violence in the region escalated to unprecedented levels. Innocents were caught in the crossfire, and terror became the constant atmosphere. Mateo's one-man war had turned into an all-out war, dragging the entire community into the vortex of his revenge. The weight of these consequences began to fall on him, adding another layer of torment to his already tortured soul. Amidst this escalation, A moment of deep reflection occurs, an internal turning point. Hiding, listening on an old radio to the news of the cartel's retaliation against civilians, Mateo is confronted with the monstrosity of his crusade. He sees himself in a shard of broken glass and barely recognizes the man staring back. It is here that he turns inward, questioning his path. "Have I become what I hunt?" he whispers into the void. The vengeance that was his fuel now seemed like just another form of destruction. He thinks about stopping, about disappearing, but the image of Sophia, brutally murdered, resurfaces in his mind, clearer than ever. It is in this instant that the decisive action manifests. The pain reignites the flame. He understands that he cannot stop, not until the head of the snake is cut off. The decision to continue, now driven not by pure fury but by a cold, calculating resolve, solidifies his purpose. He knows his soul is lost, but perhaps by destroying El Silencioso, he can prevent other Sophias from meeting the same fate. It is a fragile justification, but it is all he has left. If you who are watching have ever felt that the world turned its back on you, that injustice suffocated you to the point of giving up, know that the strength to go on can come from the darkest places. Subscribing to this channel is a way to ensure that stories of resilience, even the most tragic ones like Mateo's, continue to be told, so that no one feels completely alone in their fight. Captain Ramirez, sensing the escalating violence, knew the final confrontation was near. He focused his resources not on hunting Mateo directly, but on trying to predict the final target. El Silencioso. Ramirez operated on two fronts. Officially, he followed orders to capture the Vigilante. Unofficially, he used the hunt as a pretext to gather intelligence on the cartel leader, hoping to dismantle the organization from within should Mateo fail. He was walking a tightrope over a precipice where one wrong step could mean his death at the hands of the cartel or dishonor within the police force. He still, stubbornly, tried to serve with some integrity. Elena, in turn, became the cartel's #1 target after the fire. She was forced into hiding, constantly on the move, but she did not stop working. She communicated with Mateo through secret messages, acting as his eyes and ears, an intelligence operator in his solitary war. Their relationship, born from tragedy, had become one of mutual dependence. He was her weapon to get justice. She was his connection to the world, the only person who understood the entirety of his mission. The constant danger and their shared cause created a strange, unbreakable bond between the journalist and the ghost she had helped create. Mateo, with Elena's help, began to systematically eliminate El Silencioso's circle of protection. Each death was a chess piece removed from the board, bringing him closer to the king. He became a force of nature, a rumor, a whisper of death. His methods grew more sophisticated. He used fear as his primary weapon, turning cartel members against each other, creating paranoia and distrust within the organization. He was no longer just killing men. He was dissecting the very structure of the cartel, cutting its tendons one by one with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a vengeful Old Testament god. The penultimate step brought him to a direct confrontation with El Silencioso's head of security, a sadistic ex-military man. The battle was fought in the corridors of a luxury hotel where the cartel maintained one of its bases of operations. It was a brutal clash of tactics and strength where Mateo had to use all his cunning to survive. He emerged victorious, but the scars, both physical and emotional, deepened. Before he died, the security chief revealed the location of El Silencioso's sanctuary, not out of fear, but out of arrogance, believing that the pastor was walking into a certain death, a final trap from which he would not escape. The information was what Mateo had been waiting for. El Silencioso was hiding in a place that was the greatest of blasphemies, a desecration of everything that had once been sacred to Mateo. The cartel leader had turned an old, abandoned cathedral on a mountaintop into his personal fortress. The site of the final confrontation was set. It would not just be a battle for the body, but for the soul, a clash between the man who lost his faith and the demon who reveled in its absence. Mateo knew that climbing that mountain was his final journey. He might not come down alive, but he would make sure El Silencioso would meet him in hell. Captain Ramirez, through an informant, also discovered the location of the fortress. He faced the decision of his life: follow protocol, call for backup, and risk El Silencioso escaping thanks to his contacts in the police, or go alone, hoping to intercept Mateo and perhaps confront the cartel leader himself in a desperate attempt to restore some order. He chose a third path. He went to the location, but with the intention not to arrest, but to bear witness, to ensure that, one way or another, justice or vengeance would finally be served. Elena, upon learning of the imminent confrontation, felt a chill. Her journey with Mateo had come to an end. She had given him the tools for his revenge, and now she could only wait. She prepared to write the final story, the conclusion to the saga of the vigilante pastor. Regardless of the outcome, she would tell the whole story, that of the father, the pastor, the monster, and finally, the man who dared to challenge an entire system, even if it meant losing himself completely in the process. His story had become her own obsession, and its ending would define not only Mateo's legacy, but hers as well. The ascent up the mountain was an unholy pilgrimage. The old cathedral rose against the moon, a skeletal silhouette of forgotten faith. Mateo entered not as a worshipper, but as an executioner. The interior was a vision of hell. The main altar had been replaced by a makeshift throne. Statues of saints were defaced with cartel symbols, and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and death. At the center of it all, sitting calmly on his throne, was El Silencioso. He was not a grotesque-looking monster, but a well-dressed, middle-aged man with a serene smile that was more terrifying than any threat. He watched Mateo approach, the echo of his footsteps filling the desecrated silence of the nave, like a predator finally seeing its prey walk into the cage. The air was heavy, charged with the tension of two worlds colliding. "Welcome to my home, Pastor," said El Silencioso, his voice smooth and calculating, devoid of any emotion. "Or should I call you a colleague? Look at you. You use the darkness as I do, speak the language of violence as I do. You just decorate your work with pretty quotes." Every word was a poison designed to corrode Mateo's last shred of justification. The cartel leader did not resort to guards. His power was psychological. He stood and began to circle Mateo like a wolf studying its victim. "Your daughter. She was just business, a message, and look what a powerful message she became. She turned you into me. She made you a monster. In the end, Pastor, I created you. You should thank me." The final blasphemy was a direct blow to Mateo's wounded soul. The taunt hit its mark. For a moment, the blind rage that had driven him at the beginning threatened to consume him again. His hand trembled over his gun. This was exactly what El Silencioso wanted, to turn him into an irrational animal, proving his point that there was no difference between them. But then, the image of Sophia came to his mind. Not the image of her lifeless body, but of her smile, of her innocence. That memory was his anchor. He took a deep breath, the ice returning to his veins. "You didn't create me," Mateo answered, his voice low and steady, cutting through the air. "You just showed me the world as it truly is, a world that needs to be cleansed. My God spoke of forgiveness. Yours, apparently, is money. Today, you will meet my God, the God of vengeance." The confrontation exploded into sudden, brutal violence. It was not a long-distance shootout, but a desperate, intimate fight amidst the wreckage of the cathedral. Broken church pews became weapons. The darkness was used for ambushes, and every blow was laden with hatred. El Silencioso, despite his polished appearance, was a savage fighter, a street survivor who had risen to power through sheer brutality. He fought with a sadistic pleasure, laughing as they traded blows, trying to prove his physical and philosophical superiority. The fight was a dark mirror. The man of faith forced to use barbarism against the barbarian who saw himself as a king on a stage that symbolized the death of all sanctity. The fight led them to the cathedral's bell tower. Wounded and exhausted, they faced each other under the great silent bronze bell. El Silencioso managed to disarm Mateo, holding a knife to his throat. "It's over, Pastor. Tell me, which verse will you choose for yourself?" he mocked, his face close to Mateo's. In that moment of imminent defeat, Mateo saw not the end, but clarity. He was no longer a pastor seeking redemption, nor a monster reveling in slaughter. He was just a father. "I am not a pastor," he gasped, before using his last ounce of strength to reverse their positions, throwing them both against the tower's parapet. The knife fell into the void, and the two men were left dangerously balanced on the edge of the abyss. Here, the dramatic decision presented itself. Mateo could simply push El Silencioso to his death, a quick and brutal end, but that would be too easy. It would be the monster's victory. Instead, he grabbed him by the collar, forcing him to look into his eyes. "You will not die a martyr for your empire of filth. You will die as the nothing that you are," Mateo said. He did not utter a verse. He did not offer a final sermon. He simply looked at the man who took everything from him and saw only a pathetic emptiness. His transformation was complete, not in becoming El Silencioso, but in transcending him. He no longer needed divine justification. His pain was his only scripture. With a final surge of strength, Mateo pushed him, but not to his death. He threw him back onto the floor of the tower, away from the edge. Confused, El Silencioso stared at him. It was then that the sound of a single approaching siren cut through the night. Outside, Captain Ramirez was watching. Mateo had made a choice. He would not be the final executioner. He turned and, without looking back, began to descend into the darkness on the other side of the tower, using ropes he had prepared. He left El Silencioso, disarmed and defeated, to the justice of men, however flawed it might be. It was his final act, not of vengeance, but of renunciation. He had dismantled the cartel and broken its leader, but he refused to take the last step to become identical to him. When Captain Ramirez finally reached the tower, he found El Silencioso in a state of shock, a deposed king in his desecrated sanctuary. The arrest of the cartel leader, without a single shot fired by the police, was a seismic event. Without its head, the body of Los Espectros disintegrated into an internal power war, and the once untouchable organization collapsed under the weight of its own violence. The subsequent investigation, fueled by the information Elena Morales published in a series of bombshell reports, exposed the vast network of corruption leading to the downfall of politicians and police officers. Justice, in a twisted and bloody way, had prevailed, but its architect, the man who had lit the cleansing fire, was not there to witness it. Mateo Cruz had vanished into the night, as silently as he had moved during his hunt. Mateo's revenge was complete, but there was no celebration, no peace. The void left by Sophia's death was not filled by the deaths of her murderers. It was only deepened, an abyss that echoed with the lives he had taken and the man he had become. He realized the bitter truth. Vengeance is a fire that consumes everything, including the one who wields it. He could not go back to being the pastor, could not rebuild his life on the ashes of his crusade. The faith that had unsustained him was now a distant memory, a lullaby from a world that no longer existed. He was a ghost, haunted not by the men he had killed, but by the man he used to be and the daughter he had failed to protect. His final sacrifice was to accept that his soul was permanently lost. The whereabouts of Mateo Cruz became the stuff of legend in Michoacan. Some say he crossed the border, seeking oblivion in a foreign land. Others whisper that he continues his war in the shadows, an angel of death hunting other cartels in forgotten parts of Mexico. There are also those like Isabella who believe and pray that he found an isolated place to live out his days, seeking penance in solitude, perhaps finally finding some form of peace in the silence. His story became a cautionary tale, a dark myth told in hushed tones about the price of justice when the system fails, and about how far a good man can fall when his heart is broken. He became the vigilante pastor forever, a scar on the memory of that land. Elena Morales won a national award for her coverage, but the victory had a bittersweet taste. She told Mateo's story with brutal honesty, portraying him in all his tragic complexity. In her final article, she defined him neither as a hero nor a villain, but as a dark reflection of the society that created him. Captain Ramirez, for his part, was promoted but spent the rest of his career fighting the corruption that had nearly destroyed him, forever haunted by the memory of the pastor who did the dirty work he could not. Both, in different ways, carried the weight of Mateo's journey, living reminders that the line between justice and vengeance is, at times, indistinguishable. The story of Mateo Cruz forces us to question the limits of morality and the true meaning of faith in the face of absolute suffering. Can vengeance at any point be a path to justice? Or is it just another road to perdition? There are no easy answers. What remains is the echo of a man who lost everything and, in his darkness, became a terrifying and fascinating symbol of the human capacity for both devout love and relentless violence. If stories like this, which explore the depths of the human soul, resonate with you, consider subscribing. Your subscription allows us to continue bringing these complex and impactful narratives, ensuring that these voices, even the darkest ones, are never forgotten.